by focusing on well-being and health, you start to reset all the systems in your body to move towards reduced inflammation and better metabolism and improved energy and so forth.
Prevailing dietary wisdom over the past couple of decades has, always said that to lose weight, eat less, move more. And you said something really interesting. You said that it's more important to focus on what you're eating than how much you're eating. Why is that?
That's right. That's right. Well, it's funny, Max, when I got done the book, I realized there is no chapter on weight loss. There's no principle on weight loss because I don't actually tell people to lose weight. I help them get healthy, and the weight loss is a side effect of creating health. And it's important for people to realize that you can staple your stomach and lose weight, you can starve yourself and lose weight, you can, cabbage soup diet and lose weight, but none of those things are really long-term sustainable or pleasurable. And the key is by focusing on well-being and health, you start to reset all the systems in your body to move towards reduced inflammation and better metabolism and improved energy and so forth. And so I think the whole idea that all calories are the same basically comes from a lab because a calorie essentially is the amount of energy is required to raise the temperature of 1 liter of water 1 degree centigrade. It's just a physics problem. And if you take 1,000 calories of broccoli and 1,000 calories of Coke and you burn them in a lab, they release the same amount of energy. They're identical, right? That's true. But when you eat them, they're not the same, because they have different effects on your body. If it's just energy and calories and that's all food were, that would be fine, but it's not. It has all this other stuff in it. So the broccoli has huge amounts of fiber, phytochemicals, vitamins and minerals, very, very low sugar, lots of beneficial compounds, whereas the soda is just pure sugar, has none of that, and will make you really sick and gain weight and cause all these adverse outcomes. And even a fifth grader or a kindergartner, for that matter, would understand that there's a difference between broccoli and soda when you eat them. But most scientists, most nutritionists, most of our academic institutions, our government policies, and certainly the food industry is very dogmatic about the fact that all calories are the same and that weight loss is an energy problem. And in fact, it's really serves the interest of the food industry, because if a 100-calorie snack pack of Oreo cookies is the same as 100 calories of blueberries, then you can eat either and exchange them and you'll be the same and fine. And it's just not true. And the data on this is just extraordinary. David Ludwig and others have shown over and over again that all calories are not the same through randomized controlled trials, showing very different, profoundly different effects on metabolism. For example, by just changing the macronutrient composition. Forget all the phytochemicals, right? Just changing protein, fat, and carbs. If you have a very, very low carb diet versus a low fat diet, if they're identical calories in a group of insulin resistant patients in a randomized control study where they were given the food, there was no question about their eating, the overweight insulin resistant group that was eating the low carb diet burned 400 calories more a day. In other words, their metabolism was sped up when they cut out the sugar and starch and ate the fat. So that's just one example, but there's so many that has to do with all the other things in food besides just calories.
Also, the low carb group, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there data that suggests that even when on an isocaloric diet, they'll require less medication because they have less, they have fewer glycemic excursions, right? When they're eating fewer carbohydrates.
Yeah, of course. I mean, their blood sugar is better, their cholesterol is better. It increases muscle mass, decreases visceral or belly fat. The data is pretty compelling. But again, that's just macronutrients. Forget about that and think about the 25,000 molecules in food that are phytochemicals that come from plants and actually now are found in meat that eat plants. From data from Fred Provenza and Stephen Van Willette at Duke, it's pretty compelling when you get wild animals or when you have grass finished beef that's eating a wide variety, not just like one grass and one pasture, but a wide variety of plants. They actually increase the levels of these beneficial phytochemicals in the meat. And it can be as equivalent in dosage as much as vegetables, which is pretty amazing. So we have all these compounds, and those are regulating every function all the time. Like, for example, broccoli has glucosinolates, which I'm picking on broccoli today, but or sulforaphanes, which are these phytochemicals that aren't vitamins and minerals, not protein, fat, fiber, carbohydrates. They're these molecules that regulate, for example, detoxification. So how do you get rid of environmental chemicals and metals and pesticides? How do you get rid of your own internal toxins? Well, you need certain amounts of these compounds. They can be anti-cancer. And that's why they find, for example, that people who eat a lot of these cruciferous vegetables, when they look at high levels of these compounds in their urine, they did studies in China, they find that those who have highest levels of basically broccoli in their pee have far less cancer, right? Because it detoxifies all these toxins. That's just one example. And I could speak for hours on each of the different examples. And they're in the book, whether it's Himalayan Tartary buckwheat and the 132 phytochemicals in there that rejuvenate your immune system, whether it's the polyphenols in green tea, pomegranate, and cranberry that fertilize a particular bug in your gut called Akkermansia that's needed to improve your metabolism, reduce inflammation, deal with autoimmune disease, even actually can help you treat cancer. It's like, wow, all of a sudden you've got a whole different palette of things to work with to upgrade your health and to improve your overall well-being.
There's this pushback on social media to the notion of detoxification diets. And I think rightfully so to some degree, right? Because there's a lot of there are many supplements and juice cleanses and things that are sold under the guise of detoxifying your body. And so there's this pushback to it. But I think it's so important for people to understand that food really can help you detoxify, like that broccoli sprout study you were talking about. Help people in China get, better, more effectively excrete benzene, carcinogens like benzene, acrolein.
Right. Yeah.
This is also important. What are some of your other favorite phytonutrients to talk about?
Well, I love phytochemicals. Phytonutrients. And the one that I'm really learning a lot about now are the ones in this Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, which our friend Jeff Bland has kind of rediscovered, this ancient grain that's 3,500 years old that is grown in Himalayas, full of so many powerful compounds because it's grown under duress. It's grown in harsh conditions, in cold weather, in poor soil, and high altitudes, and poor water conditions, and drought. And yet it produces this incredible grain, or it's actually a flour, not the kind of FLOUR. It's FLOWER, and it's it turns out that just as an example of one of the things it does is it helps to rejuvenate your immune system. And what do I mean by that? Well, as you age and as you get insulted by life from chemicals and toxins and radiation, who knows what else, EMFs, your stem cells in your bone marrow can get injured that make white blood cells, and you make 1 million white blood cells every second. Like every second, you make 1 million white blood cells.
Wow.
Okay. And those stem cells kind of write the program for those white blood cells. But if the stem cells are funky, you get funky white blood cells. And then those get in your blood and they circulate around and they create all kinds of havoc, heart disease, autoimmune disease. They're called chip cells or zombie cells. And they cause immunosenescence, which means the aging of the immune system. Well, it turns out that these compounds in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, and some of them are really only found in this one plant, are immunorejuvenating and are one of the few things that will actually kill the zombie cells.
Wow.
So that's amazing. Just to me alone, if I want to, so I'm making pancakes from it. We made soba noodles from it, and it's way higher in protein, very low glycemic load, super high in vitamins and minerals, and really rich in these phytochemicals. It's, I think, the most phytochemical rich plant on the planet, because of the way it's grown, and it's stressed by the stress of its environment. It's had to produce all these defenses, which are these phytochemicals. I mean, they weren't put in the plants for us. They were put in the plants for the plants to use to defend themselves or attract, pollinators or whatever they do, plants do in their own intelligence. And we have borrowed that. That biochemistry to upregulate our biology. So we're lazy. Like, we don't make vitamin C. We have to get it from food. We don't make omega-3 fats. Other animals can make vitamin C, for example. But we sort of are lazy. And if we can grow up in an environment where we got to use all these plants, then we actually can use them for biology. And I call this symbiotic phytoadaptation, meaning that we've evolved symbiotically with plants to borrow their biochemistry to help regulate our biochemistry and use them when we need to. And they're not, quote, vitamins and minerals in the sense they're not essential nutrients, but I think they're conditionally essential, because if you don't have them over your long life, your health will be poor and you'll be not as vibrant and healthy as you could be, or you might even get really sick.
Symbiotic phytoadaptation.
I know, I made that up. Is that good?
I'm gonna start using that. What a beautiful, elegant way. What a beautiful, elegant way to describe the phenomena whereby a plant with more vigor in it, right? Like a survivor of a plant actually lends its vigor to you, right?
Right.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, when you start to look at plants these days, they're not like the plants we used to eat. The soil is low in organic matter because of tillage and chemical use. We basically killed the microbiome of the soil, which is required to extract the nutrients for the plants. So our broccoli and our vegetables are 50% less nutritious than they were 50 years ago. And on top of that, because of increasing carbon in the atmosphere, plants eat what? They eat carbon. They eat carbon dioxide. They breathe carbon dioxide. So carbon is the root of carbohydrates, right? And so they put the carbohydrates in the soil, which is good. That's the organic matter. But because of this increased carbon, what we're seeing is plants are far less nutritious because they're increasing their carbohydrate content, and their protein and nutrient content is going down. So based on looking at kind of current trends with climate change, 122 million people, just because of this increase in climate change, will be protein deficient. 1 billion people will be iron deficient. There'll be, I think, 75 million who will be zinc deficient. So we're in a situation where the way we're growing food is also the problem. And when you mentioned the plants under duress, organic is more, stressed, for example, than a conventional crop, and a wild crop is more, a wild plant is more stressed than an organic plant, right? And a regenerative is probably somewhere in the middle there. But you look at for example, a strawberry. If you ever eat a wild strawberry, it's about this big. You can barely see it, but it's like the biggest explosion of flavor you could ever imagine. That's because of all the phytochemicals, and there's phenysteine and other compounds in there that are super helpful for aging and all kinds of health benefits. Whereas if you eat a conventionally grown strawberry, it's full of pesticides. It tastes like cardboard and has almost no phytochemicals, right?
Yeah, I've started eating strawberry leaves. Like I just popped the whole thing in my mouth. Strawberry leaves are a significant source of caffeic acid, which
there you go.
is a powerful antioxidant. Yeah. That's, super interesting. So on the spectrum of, a more plant-based diet, and then we have obviously now a growing population of people on a carnivore diet who are only eating meat. Where do you stand between those two poles? What does your plate look like when you're sitting down for dinner?
Well, last night was a really good example. I'm on Maui, and there's often more deer than there are people because they were introduced by some invader years ago, and it was a bow caught deer on land next to a friend of mine. A little bit of venison, probably 4 ounces, 6 ounces. And I had Japanese sweet potato. I had oleo mushrooms, which are the incredible mushrooms with tomato sauce. And we had a big salad with watercress and radishes and avocados and a miso tahini dressing. And it was so most of my plate was like the vegetables, the tiny side of, and of course there's sometimes a little chocolate for dessert. But essentially, I think, the whole conversation about meat is very confused and very confusing. And I've discussed this many times, and they're just such polar opposite camps. And so part of the whole purpose of the book was say, look, you don't want to let your ideology trample over your biology, right? You basically, if you have a belief, for example, that you should be vegan, and you end up doing it and you feel like crap, and you lose your period and your sex drive and your muscle mass, and you become nutrition deficient, depressed, and low energy, and don't have oomph, then maybe you should listen. I was with a woman the other day who was an Olympic athlete, and she's like, she went vegan, and she's like, she just lost her power. And I talked to another elite athlete who was a tennis player, who's top 1-2 tennis players in the world, and he's like, yeah, I want to be vegan, but I can't. Like if I want to hit the ball. So I think there's a point of view of looking at what works for you based on a personalization of nutrition, which is where we're headed. And two, what makes sense scientifically based on the data we have. And I think when you look at the meat data, there's over 100,000 studies on meat, and you can find anything in there you want to read. And I got my little nutrition news, you might get that as like a little science journal, which you get like, what are the latest studies that come out? So you always kind of keep up to date, and it comes in your email box. And I just love the study, because it was like, it was so funny, because it was on the same day. It basically said, so I can find this one. Study strengthens links between red meat and heart disease. The next study down was Mediterranean diet with beef may lower risk factors for heart disease. So no wonder people are confused. The first study was a study that showed in a population, an observational study, that people who ate meat had more heart disease and heart function. And this is a study that does not prove cause and effect, but basically shows an association. And it turns out that, meat has been vilified. And so anybody who's eating meat probably is somebody who's not focused on their health, someone who isn't as committed to a healthy lifestyle, let's say. And when you look at the data, when you look at the characteristics of the meat eaters in these studies, they're more overweight. They tend to eat more calories. They smoke more, drink more, eat less fruits and vegetables, don't take their vitamins, eat more processed food, sugar, and starch. Of course, they have more disease. Is it the meat or is it the rest of their lifestyle? When you look at studies that have meat eaters and vegetarians who shop at health food stores, and you look at their risks, their risk of death goes down in half for both groups, because not what they're eating, it's what they're eating with it, right? So if you're eating meat in the context of a standard American diet, yeah. If you're eating meat in the context of a whole foods, plant-rich diet with tons of phytochemicals and spices, then no. And the other study was a randomized controlled trial, which is a more intentional study looking at cause and effect and really measuring in each individual what's going on, not just sort of looking at big populations. And they found that actually, when you ate meat, your risk factors for heart disease went down, like LDL cholesterol. And people, well, I thought meat's bad for your cholesterol. Well, that was the thinking, because meat contains saturated fat, and saturated fat raises LDL. And so that's what's bad. Turns out that the stearic acid in meat, which is the predominant saturated fat, doesn't really raise your blood cholesterol, whereas sugar and starch actually do. So sugar and starch are really the drivers of most of lipid issues in this country, which are small particles, lots of particles, high triglycerides, low HDL. That's what we call atherogenic dyslipidemia. And in English, that means it's the kind of cholesterol profile that causes heart attacks. And that comes from sugar and starch, not from eating meat or fat.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's, yeah, keep going. Sorry.
No, so the TMAO issue is interesting. People say, what about TMAO? Well, two things. One, the carnitine and stuff that they gave was a supplement, not necessarily from meat. So we don't know how that works. And also they looked at, although some were from meat, but also they looked at, other factors that are, I was talking to Stan Hazen, who's done a lot of this pioneering research. He said, yeah, if you have red wine and olive oil and balsamic vinegar with it, it mitigates the effects. I'm like, oh, so, and in the book, I talk about how, for example, in Morocco and then the Maasai, they have no real increased risk of heart disease and cancer and things we associate with meat. And so neither do the Moroccans, even though they eat a lot of meat. And the Maasai, all they eat is meat and milk. But the difference is, in Maasai, they put in 12 spices in their milk, and I think about 20 something spices in their meat. And same thing in Morocco, it's used with tons of spices. So the spices are these phytochemicals that are anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, change the ways in which these interact with your body in terms of the meat. So there's a lot of interesting sort of nuances around meat. And I think, we can talk more about it, but essentially, the three issues get conflated, which is, moral and ethical, environmental, climate, and health, right? And they're like, oh, if it's bad for one, it's bad for all. Well, it's not necessarily true. So moral and ethical, I kind of understand that. If I've monks, or I've taken care of very high lamas in the Buddhist world, and they don't want to eat meat, I'm like, okay, well, we'll figure out a really diet that has all the right components in it to help you thrive, with adequate protein and low starch and sugar. And a lot of these monks are all diabetic. A lot of these guys are all diabetic. And second is the fact that, if you think you're not harming animals by eating vegetables, you're not completely, getting the full story. And right. Here's why. When you actually do agriculture, it's a destructive act. So if you're growing a cabbage patch and you're destroying the habitat of all sorts of animals, and then you go in and mow it down and collect it, whatever, you're going to kill the rabbits or the moles or the mice or the birds. And the question is, well, is a rabbit's life any less valuable than a cow's life or a chicken's life? I don't know. But I mean, we're killing 7 billion animals a year just from vegetable agriculture. So you can't get out of that. And also, people are having organic vegetables. Well, how do they grow the organic vegetables? They use cow manure and bone meal and oyster shells and animal products to grow the vegetables. So your grass-fed beef is a vegan. whereas your broccoli is a carnivore.
Yeah.
So, and then lastly is health. And I think that's sort of what we were speaking to earlier, which is the idea that, oh yeah, and the climate issues and the environmental issues. I think for sure factory farming and traditional agriculture is a disaster and should be banned. And it has for all sorts of reasons, climate, environment, inhumane treatment of animals, less poor quality product, et cetera. That's not good for human health. That should just be banned. But that's not to say that regeneratively raised beef is bad. And it turns out that you need animals to regenerate soil, which is critical for climate change. And I was just speaking to some woman who was a billionaire lady whose entire focus is a very smart woman who's very focused on solving climate change. And she said she looked with all her resources and all her scientists and all the data and everything, she looked around and wanted to come up with some cool solution and realized that it was dirt. It was soil. It was turning dirt to soil. And that is the number one solution for climate change. And literally investing tons of money and doing the research on this and looking further at it. And it just sort of struck me that, people just don't understand how important it is. And the only way to really build soil is to include animals as part of an ecosystem on the farm. And that doesn't mean you have to eat them. It doesn't mean you have to eat a lot of them. It just means that they have to be in there to build soil through peeing, pooping, digging around, and so forth. And lastly, the health issue, to talk about is so important, because if you're eating grass-finished, regeneratively raised meat with tons of phytochemicals, well, that's very different than eating a feedlot cow.
Yeah.
And there's even been randomized trials looking at, for example, wild kangaroo meat versus feedlot meat and its effect on biology. And even though it's the same gram for gram protein, when they feed them the kangaroo meat, levels of inflammatory markers go down. When they feed the feedlot beef, the inflammatory markers go up. So beef is not beef. So I think it's as Russ Conzer says, who's an organic farmer, regenerative farmer, says, it's not the cow, it's the how, across the board on all of these things.
So that leads me to, I guess, the logical follow-up, which would be, what can we do in our diets and lifestyles to mitigate neuroinflammation, early on? You've written a number of books about that, and we also we were linked up via our friends who produce a nicotinamide riboside product, which boosts NAD in the brain. This is a topic that I really have yet to do a deep dive into, but would love to know your thoughts on that and what that's all about.
Yeah. So I think we also did a Dr. Oz together where I was using the acronym I had just come up with at the time, SHIELD.
SHIELD, yeah, I vaguely remember, yes.
The SHIELD, so these are the things you can do. I was trying to encapsulate when I wrote The Healing Self with Deepak Chopra. And at the end of the book, we came up with all these things you can do every day to try to minimize inflammation in your body and brain. And then I tried to come up with an acronym that encapsulated them all. And I came up with SHIELD, which is sleep, 7 to 8 hours. So you get these little microglial scrubby bubbles to clean your brain. H is handle stress, because stress causes cortisol, and chronic stress can cause inflammation. So meditation practice and the like. I is interact with others, because loneliness is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. Not being alone. If you're alone and like it, that's great. Alone in your stress, that's bad. E is exercise. Obviously, exercise does everything. It helps clear plaque from the brain. It stops inflammation. We showed in a paper in Science last year that it induces the birth of new nerve cells in the brain, in the part of the brain that's affected in Alzheimer's, the short-term memory area called hippocampus. It's called neurogenesis, the birth of new nerve cells. So exercise is good for everything. So that's why I have in back of me my recumbent bike. I got my treadmill here, and then there's my keyboards for stress relief. So, it's all right here in my home office.
I don't know how many people know this about you, but you're a professional keyboard player. You've written and recorded songs. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah, I do keyboards for Aerosmith and Joe Perry, the lead guitarist for Aerosmith. So I did the last Aerosmith album, and I did all of the keyboards on the last album with Joe Perry and Johnny Depp and a bunch of guest musicians. But just studio stuff. I don't have time to gig. I'm too busy in the lab. But very rarely do I play live, just once in a while if it's something really cool. Like we did the Tonight Show. We did Muhammad Ali's 70th birthday party, really cool gigs. But otherwise, just a studio rap,
That's so cool.
But yeah. So SHIELD. So E was for exercise, and L is for learning new things, because when you learn new things, you make more synapses and more connections between nerve cells in the brain. And the more synapses you make, the more you can lose before you lose it. That's the bottom line. So you build up your synaptic reserve. Because as you learn, not brain games, mind you, learning new things. Because when you learn new things, you make new synapses and they connect with old ones, because learning is always associating the new thing with the old one. You're building this neural network. And when you learn new things, you're reinforcing your neural network. You're creating redundancy in the connections so you can remember something better in the future by having a new pathway there because you learned it in a new light today. So synaptic reserve is very important. So by learning new things right now on your show, on this video, you're helping people out.
Yeah, we're all boosting our cognitive reserve thanks to you.
And if we're putting them to sleep, we're still helping them. It doesn't even matter.
Because sleep is good for the brain as well.
Good,
there you go. It's a win-win.
So, yeah. And D is diet. Okay, so diet, Mediterranean diet was called the DASH diet, the MIND diet. All these are mainly meant at keeping your gut microbiome happy. So you've written about this, and I've written about this, that the bacteria in your gut, trillions of bacteria in your gut are your friends. They need to be happy and balanced. And if they are, they also fight inflammation in the brain. We even showed that by altering the microbiome of the gut of mice with Alzheimer's, we could lower amyloid in the brain. So there's this two-way street between brain and gut, this gut-brain axis. And the more you keep your gut bacteria happy, it helps with mood, it helps with brain health, it helps with inflammation, it helps with this amyloid debris that's building up in your brain. So the way you keep the bacteria happy is you feed them plants. They like fiber. I mean, we evolved as vegetarians. We have grinders, not fangs that gnash. Our stomach pH is for dealing with plants, not raw meat. A tiger has a completely acidic pH in their stomach, so they can eat raw meat after they tear it with their fangs, and that raw meat doesn't make them sick, right? The acid just kills everything in it. And then they have a GI that's straight to
the butt,
out, because you don't want meat to putrefy in a colon that wraps around like ours. So, somewhere along the line, even though we evolved originally as vegetarians due to our biology, something went wrong at some point where we needed to eat meat to survive. And we're still getting through that phase of our evolution. So we still depend on meat, even though we didn't evolve that way. So the gut bacteria don't like meat. They like plants. They evolved to like seeds, nuts, vegetables, fruits, all the things that give fiber. And so plant fiber is important. So a lot of people take probiotics, and that's great. But prebiotics, which are the plant-based diet, is what those bacteria really like and how you keep them happy. And you can buy probiotics with prebiotics in them. They're called symbiotics, SYN biotics. So that's one side of diet. The other side of diet is supplements, right? Now supplements get really kind of sensitive because, frankly, most supplements out there for the brain are trash.
Yeah.
They're money-making, snake oil, trash. Sorry. And what really gets me is these brain supplements where they say, with 20 different ingredients, and the capsule's this big. And you're like, well, wait, you need actually a capsule that big of just one of those ingredients for it to maybe do something. And you don't have enough of any of those 20 different ingredients to do a darn thing. So be careful with those.
Right.
So what you need to look for, so what we do is we screen in my lab, in our little mini brain, besides drugs, we screen supplements and every natural product known to man. We just buy the libraries and screen them all at once. And some of the things that we find, I've actually gone to commercial entities. Like we found that nicotinamide riboside very actively induces neurogenesis. Remember I said exercise does in the brain? The birth of new neurons in the brain and the hippocampus? Nicotinamide riboside does that.
That's fascinating.
And we also know that if you're trying to protect neurons against neuroinflammation, so you want to increase the mitochondrial function. The mitochondria is the battery of the cell. And what oxidative stress does is it reduces the battery. So if you want to up the battery needs more fuel. Well, the fuel for your cell battery, the mitochondria, is ATP. And ATP is a pathway that makes it, and that involves something called NAD plus. And the way you get to NAD is nicotinamide riboside. So if you take nicotinamide riboside as a supplement, you get more NAD, and then that gives you more ATP, which is cellular fuel. And that helps protect the cells against this free radicals and oxidative stress. So nicotinamide riboside worked really well on our screens. And then we teamed up with Chromadex. Chromadex did hire me as a consultant, so they pay me. Now, not much, but they pay me. And but they do send me free True Niagen. True Niagen is their brand of nicotinamide riboside. But yeah, so that's like if something works, I'm not afraid to get commercially involved. I just make it transparent for conflict of interest and say, yeah, I'm a consultant for that company. And another supplement that worked was this woody vine from Peru, from the Amazonian rainforest, called cat's claw, because the thorn on this plant looks like a claw of a cat. And so I started a company with my friend Alan Snow in Seattle called Cognitive Clarity, and we sustainably mine organic cat's claw from Peru, and then sell that in capsules as Percepta, Percepta, Percepta. And again, I'm a founder of that, one of the founders of that company. It's mainly Alan's company, but I have to state that for conflict of interest purposes. So those are my two favorites, would be True Niagen and Percepta. But in our screen, we found other things work well. Things like quercetin, Quercetin, fisetin, ashwagandha, we found helps get the amyloid out of the brain. Ashwagandha is a Ayurvedic. Another Ayurvedic, Bacopa, Monieri, work really well. So as we find them, I just share them with family and friends, and I share them with local professional sports teams because they're getting banged in the head all day. And but I tell everybody, look, check with your doc first before you take these. Like Percepta, the cat's claw, if you have super low blood pressure, you're not supposed to take it. If you're on a blood thinner, you're not supposed to take it, right? So that's all on the box. Yeah. But I tell people, just remember, we have not done any clinical trials to show that any of these supplements prevent Alzheimer's or treat it. So we're not making any claims like that. And without clinical trials, all you can say is, look, these worked in the lab and lab models, whether it's Alzheimer's in a dish or a mouse, they're safe. So if you want to give them a shot, check with your doc and do so. But we don't want to oversell. You don't want to oversell anything. You don't want to oversell even lifestyle intervention. I mean, there are people out there who say, my lifestyle protocol is guaranteed to reverse and end Alzheimer's. No. Until you do the clinical trials, it's a good idea to tell people to do it, but don't give them false promises.
Amen. Yeah. I'm with you 1,000%. I know that my listeners really appreciate the transparency. I really appreciate the transparency. That's how I am, when I talk about the products that I endorse and have commercial relationships with. And it upsets me when you see people in the functional medicine community, which, for all intents and purposes, I'm a fan of functional medicine, but there is language sometimes that I think pushes the boundaries of what we currently know to be true about Alzheimer's disease and other conditions. But for me, as my listeners know, I take very seriously the claims that people make because I had a family member affected with dementia. I mean, we've been in this pandemic for 18 months now, 19 months. Where is the call to action from our governing bodies, our politicians, the mainstream media, to step on the gas when it comes to lifestyle and proper nutrition? Now, I just want to be clear in that I definitely think that there's value in the vaccine. So I don't want people to think that I'm placing diet and lifestyle over vaccine when it comes to the immediate time frame, right? Like, lifestyle change is difficult. It takes a long time. But we're talking about 18 to 19 months of runway that people have had, and there hasn't been so much as a whisper. And of course, age is still the number one risk factor when it comes to COVID severity, and age is not modifiable, but your body composition is, obesity is a modifiable risk factor. Type 2 diabetes is a modifiable risk factor. So it makes me so angry that nobody's saying, eat better food, tend to your sleep, get more exercise. Not even so much as a whisper.
Listen, So this was published in the American Journal of Infection Control. The study is titled Lack of Sleep Can Jeopardize Vaccine Effectiveness. What the researchers uncovered was that folks who were sleeping less than 6 hours a night, which is not uncommon in our society, were over 11 times less likely to be protected by a vaccine than those getting adequate sleep. 11 times, not 2 times, not 5, not 7, 11 times.
Wow.
So this isn't, again, this seems like it's a second tier thing, but it's a first tier thing. It makes everything work better, whether you have a pharmaceutical intervention or just a general being a human in the real world. These are things your genes require, your immune system requires. So one of the big issues today is this cytokine storm, right? That's what people hear the headlines. The cytokine, it sounds scary, right? You got the cytokine storm. Or it sound, for me, when I first heard it, I was like, sounds like, I don't know, Thor's doing his thing. He's got the, his Mjolnir and the storm is happening.
It sounds cool. It sounds like something out of like the latest Avengers.
That's it.
Flick.
That's what I picked up. But, with the cytokine storm, this is basically an overreaction of the immune system. And this gets into the topic of inflammation. And inflammation isn't a bad thing. It's a miraculous system that's evolved with us over, countless, like we're talking millions of years of evolution here, but it's a hyper intelligent system that the immune response essentially is kind of a distress signal for the body to signal immune parameters, immune cells to come to the site of infection, to defend against a pathogen, or to come to the site of an injury. It's an absolutely essential in healing. Without inflammation, you would never heal from anything. And so, but now if we're getting to a state of chronic inflammation or an overactive response of inflammation, that's when things can get a little bit sketchy. So with the cytokine storm, but this was published in PLOS One. So it's a Public Library of Science 1. They uncovered that folks who are sleep deprived have excessive response in the increased production and activity of pro-inflammatory cytokines. This was well known. And also, when individuals are sleep deprived, because cytokines, there are different ones. There are interleukins, there are chemokines. It's not just one thing. And also, here's the thing. What are they? They're proteins. What are proteins made of? Food. But anyway, so we'll just leave that as a little sidebar. But there are different types of cytokines. And some cytokines are actually required to regulate our sleep cycle. So some of them are involved in like helping to shift you into REM sleep, for example. And so it's really fascinating, really cool how our immune system is involved in sleep itself. They're like intertwined so deeply. But sleep deprivation reduces the production of these anti-inflammatory, sleep fortifying cytokines and increases pro-inflammatory cytokines. So could this be a contributing factor to the poor outcomes we've seen with, again, 115 Americans regularly being sleep deprived? I mean, come on, like I don't have to make this stuff up. It's so obvious. Are we doing anything about it? Of course not. Not once has this type of information been mentioned. And this shouldn't be surprising. For me, in the beginning, I honestly went through, and I know a lot of people felt the same. I went through phases. Initially, I was kind of confused and surprised. Like, why are we not talking about getting folks healthier? Like, I saw the data coming out of Italy. I was like, we're in trouble here. Like, we're so unhealthy as a society. Let's talk about like making sure that our citizens are getting more resilient, helping to, fortify their immune system, all those things, especially because we didn't have any viable treatments. And so, well, agreed upon treatments, let's say that. And when I didn't hear a peep about it, like after a couple of weeks, I'm just like, yeah, this is because this never gets talked about anyway. So I don't know what I was thinking. And so I took it upon myself to really take things to an entirely new level and to share that information, to share the data, because every single thing I said at the beginning has come to pass, everything. And one of those things, so about a month into it, so this was probably April, May, I was seeing the very concerning amount of fear being like, there was the death toll ticker on CNN, like relegating human lives to numbers on the screen. And I was like, something's not right. This is not right. It's not okay. Why are we not hearing about any type of solution or any good things happening? We had a lot of folks who were, not even, being asymptomatic, the vast majority. So after looking at things long term, we're talking almost 9 out of 10 folks having mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. It's just like, there's no context here, so it's just fear, fear, fear. And so what I did was, and I also don't want to lean onto my own experience as well. So I reached out. First person I talked to was an epidemiologist. First person I talked to. The next person, when I was looking at, like, is this an issue with this kind of rampant fear? And I reached out to Bruce Lipton, Dr. Bruce Lipton, who cell biologist. He's the pioneer. Like the reason people know the term epigenetics in our culture is because of Bruce Lipton. And so I got on a call with him and I asked him about these things. And in many ways, it was affirming what I knew, but also he hit me with something that, again, I had to be open to accept, because I was still talking about, like, we got to make sure we're eating well. We got to make sure this and that. And he's like, no, the mind is the most powerful epigenetic controller, Sean. And he just brought me back to that thing that I knew, which is every thought we have creates chemistry in our body. Like, we have the most powerful pharmacy in the universe, literally in our system. And it's beyond bioidentical. It is identical. It is made for you. And so I knew, based on the conversation, based on my 20 years of experience, with people not having a logical fear that had some context around it, that can allow them to still function in the world and not be afraid of, seeing somebody outside, for example. And I knew that what's likely going to happen, because what that does is it creates a cortisol-driven response in the body, which is, in a short instance, it can be supportive if fear happens with the immune system based on our evolutionary biology. But chronic, as days go by, weeks, months of you being in terror and constantly watching the news, wow, what happens is the immune system essentially is getting disrupted to such a degree that if we're talking about these pro-inflammatory cytokines, so one of these studies, and this was looking at the psychosomatic effects of COVID-19, was the title of the paper essentially. And they were just affirming, like, hey, when we get into this state where we're experiencing these mental health challenges, it's increasing inflammation in the body. And now you get a pro-inflammatory, pre-inflamed state, and then you meet with a disease that has a tropism towards the lung tissue, towards the endothelium, that is pro-inflammatory. What do you think is going to happen? So here's how it all played out. Okay, so I'm bringing this up like, hey, we've got to do something about the fear propagation. We definitely need to exercise caution, do things smart, but let's lean into the evidence and what we can do here, and all the good things that are happening in the world, all the people that are okay. And how are they okay? Let's talk about those things. None of that was happening. And so I was just seeing it mapped out. And here's what happened. The CDC, and this was just about 2 months ago, published a report. And they analyzed, and of course you could throw this in the show notes for everybody, because this one is seeing is believing, for real. They analyzed over 540,000 COVID-19 patients from over 800 US hospitals. And after analyzing the data, they found that the number one risk factor for death from COVID-19 is obesity. Number one. We know that already. Are we doing anything about it? Of course not. But we know it. But here's the thing. The second leading risk factor for death from COVID-19 in this report, published by the CDC, was anxiety and fear-related disorders.
Wow.
The second leading second leading risk factor for death. It should be the biggest thing. It should be on all the headlines. How is fear involved in death from COVID-19? But the same media outlets that would share something like that, it would be going against what they're about. That's what they do. And, you probably caught Charlie Chester, CNN getting caught on the hot mic. Did you see that video?
No, what was that about? What?
I've shared it, like, I even put it into different content pieces. It just went viral, crazy stuff. So he got caught on a hot mic, the technical director of CNN. And by all news networks, I'm not pro any of these news networks. Please understand at this point. But he got caught on a hot mic, somebody, this news network. And some people who know about this, I don't care about the news network that caught him. It's more of an internet style news network.
Yeah.
Guerrilla style, really, doing this journalism a different way. I don't care about who they are, what they're about. I care about the information.
Of course.
And what was revealed. But he was caught on the hot mic saying that, they asked him about the death toll ticker. And he was like, COVID, it's gangbusters for ratings.
Wow.
He was like, we put the death toll ticker up. And he's like, some days we see it and I'm just like, it should be higher. It should be higher. And he's like, man, that's messed up that I'm even thinking that. We're talking about human lives here. And he's caught saying this. And then he's saying that we purposely put it there. And he says the words that we hear. We hear people say these words. But he said, if it bleeds, it leads. He said the words out of his own mouth. He's one step under the director at the channel. And the person asked him also, why don't you put up a recovery ticker? I put that question into the internet world when this all happened, right? So I know that there's a connection there. Why don't they put up a recovery ticker to actually have some context here? And he looked just kind of thrown off, like what? He didn't understand the question. And he was like, because that's not scary. And then he mentioned that after the onslaught of fear at the end of the segment, so maybe it's like 55 minutes of fear, that last segment, they do something is called, the feel good story, right? So he said it's kind of like the ice cream at the end of the suffering, right?
Wow.
And so just to hear it out of the mouth but you didn't even hear this. You know what I'm saying? It's just like that stuff is like here today, gone today. Yeah. We know that they're happening. People they can see and they could still be like, well, I love fill in the blank reporter. You know what I mean? And we got to understand that the systems that are controlling our decisions and propagating fear, they've been complicit in the deaths of so many people because fear is literally tearing our biology apart. We were not designed to be afraid like this all the time. It's incredibly abnormal and it's creating more susceptibility. And I just want to stand for something, to do something about it, to make people feel more empowered. Yes, be intelligent, be cautious, but don't be enthralled and imprisoned by fear. That's going to lead to an early demise. Period. End of story.
For heart health, you should do cardiovascular activity, not resistance training. Okay, this is actually false. We now have studies that show that for heart health, resistance training is actually superior. Cardiovascular activity is good too. And by the way, I want to let everybody know that all forms of exercise, so long as they're done appropriately, have value. So I'm not saying don't do other forms of exercise. They all have value. All I'm saying is if you had to pick one, or you're like the average person, then resistance training is the one that you should make the cornerstone of your routine. It's just going to give you the most bang for your buck. But again, the study showed that when it came to heart health, resistance training was superior. And again, it probably had to do with the fact that your insulin sensitivity is much better, reduces inflammation, and your body is slowly turning into kind of this fat burning machine. In fact, if you look at as a trainer or anybody that's works in, if you're watching this and you've worked in gyms before, you know what I'm talking about. People who make cardiovascular activity, running, cycling, whatever, the cornerstone of the routine when they're looking for weight loss, typically what they'll notice is they'll get this initial fast weight loss, then this hard plateau, right? So, I lost 10 pounds and then nothing. Now my metabolism has adapted, things have slowed down. In order to lose any more body fat now, or weight, I should say, I have to do more or cut my calories even more. And by the way, studies confirm this, the weight that you do lose with that form of exercise is usually half muscle, half body fat. So you're actually not getting leaner, you're just getting smaller.
Yikes.
So in other words, if you lose 10 pounds and half is muscle, half is fat, your body fat percentage has actually stayed the same. I've actually seen people lose weight and their body fat percentage go up.
Wow.
Because they lost more muscle than body fat. Remember, it's a percentage of your body weight. That's what's important, right? So, I may be lean at 210 pounds, but if you took my body fat and put it on a 5-foot person, it'd probably be a lot more because they have so much less body mass.
So they're actually exercising their way to being skinny fat.
Absolutely.
That's insane.
100%. So they'll notice this quick drop and then this hard plateau. Now with resistance training, you notice a slower weight loss, but then it starts to snowball. As the metabolism kicks in, as things start to work, you get the snowball effect. And then you get to this point where you're doing it consistently for 4, 5, 6 months. And you're like, this is weird. I'm eating more than I did before, and I'm just getting leaner. And those are the kind of comments that I would get from clients that come to me and be like, Sal, I'm eating more food. I'm getting leaner. I'm only working with you 2 days a week or 3 days a week. Like, this is really strange. You're like, what's going on here? I'm like, well, your metabolism is really, kicking into gear. So, so back to the heart health. It does a tremendous job for heart health. We talked about the brain. You want to talk about brain health? Again, now we have studies that show that it's so far, again, there's the only form of exercise that actually has halted what the things that happen that turn into Alzheimer's or dementia, resistance training. And they think it has to do with the insulin sensitivity and the way the body utilizes, glucose. I know that some researchers refer to Alzheimer's and dementia as type 3 diabetes.
Yeah, it's shocking.
Yeah, because of that, right? So there you go. So, and there's so many more. I mean, bone health, this is very obvious. If you're building muscle, you're building bone. There's no form of exercise that'll stop or reverse osteopenia like resistance training. There's just nothing like it. Brain health here's from a different standpoint. Proprioceptive ability. That's knowing where my body is in space, right? Most forms of exercise are very repetitive. So if I run, it's the same motion. If I walk, it's the same motion. If I cycle, resistance training is just, there's an almost infinite number of movements and exercises and ways to position my body. It's not one of those types of workouts that I could just not think about while I'm doing. You're focused, you're there, you're present, you're placing your feet down, you're moving in a particular way with intention and control. And so it really does develop those parts of the brain that have to do with body awareness and balance, better than other forms of exercise. And, part of the challenge has been that the studies on exercise that we've done, now for the last 4 or 5 decades, the vast majority of them, if it had to do with health, it was done with cardiovascular exercise usually.
Right.
It was almost never done with resistance training.
Why is that?
Partially because resistance training really was relegated to weightlifting and athletic performance. So if they did a study on athletic performance or strength, then you would sometimes see resistance training. But if it had to do with health, like, how does exercise improve blood pressure or blood lipid levels, or how does exercise help with cognition? They almost never picked resistance training. So these other forms of exercise got all this amazing publicity through these studies. Resistance training had no studies.
I also think, like, from a basic science standpoint, it's a lot easier to get an animal to do cardiovascular or, quote unquote, aerobic exercise than it is to get an animal to lift weights.
That's not a bad point. I didn't even think of that. Absolutely. Now, though, we are seeing a lot of studies on resistance training, and it's starting to really open up. For example, a simple strength test is one of the best single metrics that can predict all-cause mortality.
Yeah, even like grip strength, which is sort of like a surrogate proxy marker for full body vigor.
Yeah,
I don't know how tightly that's correlated, but if you have a weak grip, that's probably a pretty good sign that you're frail.
That's what the studies show. So, like, if you want to predict all-cause mortality, it's obviously best to have multiple tests and parameters. But
data points,
But if you just had one, believe it or not, testing someone's strength is actually one of the most accurate predictors. And they do it either through grip or a simple, can you get up off the floor without having to grab onto something test.
Wow.
That's it. And they can actually predict all-cause mortality relatively accurately with that versus even testing your blood lipids or your blood pressure. So it's pretty incredible. And if you look at what's happened to us with our modern lives, we're so sedentary, yet we're so busy, right? So it's not like we're not doing anything. We got things are so scheduled all the time, and I got to take the kids here, and I got a job, and then I'm gonna do this, and then so we're very sedentary, but we're also very busy, and we're just weak. We're very weak. We don't have much strength. We don't have much muscle, and muscle is such an incredible protect. It's like a suit of armor that protects you against chronic disease, against degeneration of the brain or the joints, and we have none of it. And then what do? We tell people, here, you want to exercise? Go do this form of exercise that is going to make you not build any muscle, or maybe even lose a little bit of muscle. So it's no wonder people work out and they're like, this isn't working for me. Why am I not getting good results? I lost some weight for the first month, and now I'm where I'm at, and I'm not eating very much, and it's just not working for me.
A lot of women have this perception that red meat is bad. or it's going to make them bulky, or they shouldn't have too much of it. I've noticed that, but it's so satiating, especially the fattier cuts of red meat, even the ground. Of course, it's very popular to get ribeyes and things like that. But the fattier the meat, the more satiating and filling it is. It's hard to, especially if you're eating in a compressed feeding pattern, like we sort of talked about early time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. If you have like a 12-ounce ribeye, you're not going to want these donuts and these things that these guilty pleasures, because you're going to be satiated.
Yeah.
So that's the other part about it that I think is unique.
What about for people that are prone to like dyslipidemia, like recommending fatty cuts of meat multiple times a day potentially?
I think it's just worth testing your biology. If you are prone to hyperlipidemia or familial hyperlipidemia, maybe what you can do is,
in other words, like, high cholesterol levels, you go to the doctor and, neither of us are like big sort of like, anti-cholesterol people or anything like that. But still, nobody likes to get a bad report from the doctor. So you go to the doctor, oops, your total cholesterol, maybe your LDL-C is elevated. Yeah. What do you do in that scenario?
Well, I think we also need to consider our triglycerides and our glucose, hemoglobin A1C in that context, because high LDL, independent of other increased risk factors, may not be so suggestive of cardiovascular disease development, which I know is controversial, because we've been taught over the years, and LDL is bad cholesterol, HDL is good cholesterol.
It is controversial. I mean, there are some in the evidence-based camp on online that will say the opposite. They'll say that LDL is an independent risk factor. Elevated LDL is an independent risk factor,
right,
for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease.
100%. And so what I would say is get additional testing. Look at your ApoB and ApoA1 ratio. So these are on the exterior portion of LDL or remnant lipoprotein or VLDL. These are all these so-called atherogenic LDL related particles. They have an apolipoprotein B on them. So let me just back up. When you just go and I know you know this is Fried-Wald equation. So when you go to the doctor, you do your annual physical, you get your blood work, the cholesterol number that you're getting, it's really just a mathematical estimate. It's not a direct measurement. And a lot of people don't know that. And unfortunately, that estimate often drives clinical decisions. Oh, Sally, you need to be on a statin. Oh, Bill, you need to be on a fenofibrate, whatever. Whereas we need to look at the direct apolipoproteins or do an expanded lipoprotein particle profile where you actually look at the size and the shape and the actual phenotypic expression of these lipoproteins. So that's the first thing that I would say is, if you're in that situation with your doctor and you have familial hyperlipidemia or your LDL increases, go a little step further and look at apolipoprotein B or A1. It doesn't they're like $20 tests and they should be run. Then also consider your triglycerides as well and your liver enzymes, because as the fat starts to increase, whether we get more insulin resistant or hyperlipidemia, then it's going to infiltrate the liver and the pancreas and the so-called ectopic fat deposition. That's really the problem, in addition to develop or sort of infiltrating the fat within the arterial system, creating that process that you mentioned, atherosclerosis.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Realizing like you can't actually operate on the immune system. Like it doesn't make sense. Like you may operate on the downstream symptoms of a condition, but you're not actually sending that patient away with optimized cellular biology. You're not actually fixing the root cause of the problem. And when you look at some of the top killers in the United States, which are like heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, all of these we also know have a lot of inflammation going on with them. And when you sort of create this Venn diagram of like the cytokines or immune mediators that are sort of upregulated in these conditions, the one for all the ENT conditions are kind of the same for all the ones that are these chronic disorders. It's like, interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. And not to get too wonky, but it's like there's clearly something going on that's related to all of these things. Why don't we treat at that level in medicine? Well, because we're in a reactive system that waits until diseases manifest and then we play whack-a-mole medicine, where unfortunately we treat each condition as if they're totally separate, different things, as if they're isolated silos. And that feeds into the system that we have where we kind of give a different medication for every single condition.